Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Deep Roots Native Plant webinar. I'm your host, Sydney Ross, Outdoor Education Manager with Deep Roots, and we have a fabulous show for you today with our guest expert, Taylor Neff, who is an urban forester with Missouri Department of Conservation. First, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Johnson County Park and Recreation District and Missouri Department of Conservation, for connecting people to resources and nature in their backyards and beyond. And special thanks to donors like you. Next week is our annual Native Plant Conference, Planet Native Landscapes, and we have sold out. But don't fret. If you're feeling FOMO for not getting signed up, be sure to join our wait list because sometimes you never know what can happen and a spot could open up. So for those who are registered, I look forward to seeing you all next week. Coming soon, hop on board to our Habitat Garden Tours, which start this April. Be sure to visit us online and join our 2025 season subscription. Or if you are a gardener or nature lover, consider volunteering, where you get some sneak peeks of these amazing gardens, one-on-one time with the gardeners, and more. It's a ton of fun. In addition to our Habitat Garden Tours, we are going to have our native plant sales in coordination the same day as those garden tours. So our first garden tour and plant sale will take place in Prairie Village, Kansas on Saturday, April 12th. To learn more, visit us online at deeproots.org/habitat gardens. It's going to be fun and spring will be here before we know it. This webinar will be recorded and all resources will be available online, and we'll email you a link and resources following this event. Don't forget, let us know where you're tuning in from in the chat, and if you have questions for our guest expert, Taylor Neff, be sure to put those in the Q&A section. Taylor's going to stick around following her presentation to answer your questions about pruning trees live during our Deep Roots Native Plant webinar. Following today's show, visit us online at deeproots.org, where you can find information about upcoming events, webinars, native gardening resources, and how to get involved. While you're there, consider making a donation. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Taylor Neff. She is our community forester for Missouri Department of Conservation, where she provides technical assistance and training to governments, commercial arborists, and the public in Kansas City, Clay County, and Platte County. Her recent work and interests include tree preservation, biomimicry, schoolyard greening, agroforestry, and seeking to ensure equitable access to resources for all. Taylor is an ISA certified arborist, ISA tree risk assessment qualified, two-time Midwestern tree climbing champion, wildland firefighter, and vice president of the Kansas Arborist Association. Taylor, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today for this Deep Roots Native Plant webinar. How's it going, Tay?
Hi, good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We're so excited to have a tree expert joining us. And Taylor, what are some programs that you're looking forward to or working on right now?
Yeah, well, everything's kind of asleep right now, so dormant season could be a little bit slower, but spring feels right around the corner. So planning for planting projects, working with the cemetery down the road from the Discovery Center, Forest Hill Calvary Cemetery is a really cool habitat, and we're going to be planting some trees there in March. So that's kind of top of mind.
That's awesome. I recently attended a guided bird hike with Sally Luck, who's a master naturalist for the Osage Trails chapter, and I was blown away at all the wildlife and habitat there. So I think that is just a really cool project, and I look forward to returning. And I'm all about spending more time at cemeteries because they're actually really amazing places, and maybe we should start picnicking there again.
Totally.
Okay. Well, I know we've got a lot of information to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and let you share your presentation. And folks, remember, if you have questions for Taylor about pruning trees, be sure to put them in the Q&A section. All right, let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, how we looking?
Not seeing it quite yet, but I went ahead and, oh, there we go. It's coming up. Perfect. We're going. I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, and if you need, just holler.
Okay, great. I'm gonna pull up the timer really fast since I love to pack in information. I won't go over. Okay, so yeah, thanks for having me. We're gonna talk about tree pruning today. Um, I am with the Missouri Department of Conservation, like Sydney said, so we work to protect fish forests and wildlife in the state. My role is a community or urban forester, so I am working to protect our urban forests. Before I came to the department, I worked in private tree care, and then I worked for Bridging the Gap's Heartland Tree Alliance program, and we did planting and pruning in contract for the city of Kansas City. So I really love talking about this topic. I have to give a nod to Dr. Alex Shigo. He's kind of known as the father of modern arboriculture, and he has a lot of really cool images and books that he's put together. But I like this quote. There's a lot of old treatments that didn't work so well in the past, such as like filling holes in trees with concrete and things like that we don't do anymore. And then he always talks about if people are going to be working with trees, you just need to get out and touch them. So it's a little bit odd that we're doing this online, but I'm excited to be able to show you a bunch of different trees all in one place, and then you can come find me in the field later on. So here are my objectives. I hope that you can get these things out of today. We want to identify strong structure in trees because that's a big reason why we prune. Describe the other reasons that we might prune or wound trees. Learn how to prune young and small trees with minimal damage. I threw an asterisk on there just because it takes just a lot of time and practice to learn the response to trees. And then avoiding hurtful practices because I'm seeing so many bad pruning practices in our landscape in Kansas City. So if I can show you guys what that looks like and we can stop paying for people to do that to our trees, that would be great. So here's just the topics again that we'll try to get through. So pruning is an intentional wounding. So we want to have a reason. So if it's wounding, then why are we doing it? If you live in the heart of KC like I do, you probably have seen this tree if you've been to Gillen Park. And if you've seen this tree, you've probably hugged it. And so you've probably looked up and noticed that all of the limbs on this tree are like the size of a tree trunk themselves. It's a massive tree because it's open grown. So it has a lot more resources and a lot more sunlight as opposed to these sycamore trees. This is at Shaw Nature Reserve. I was climbing an oak tree, and you can see that it's self-pruning, right? Because the limbs are shaded out, so you don't have a first limb for maybe 60 to 80 feet in the air. But also, why are we pruning trees? Do we have to? This is a massive northern red oak tree at the Olathe Community Center that I love. You can see the young children there at the bottom, and how special can it be if we don't over manipulate? Yeah, pruning can feel like another way that man is manipulating nature, which like sometimes feels like in conflict with me. But when we live in unnatural environments, sometimes we do unnatural things to manage our trees. So we have homes. That's my mom's house there on the left, and the former owner planted a cedar tree, and it's completely like shredded her window screens on the other side. So a lot of the pruning can be avoided if we're choosing species more thoughtfully and making sure that they have the growing space that they need. This is a crabapple, I think, in an easement, and it just takes so much maintenance to keep that above people on the sidewalk and cars in the street. Another big reason we're going to talk about strong structure because we prune to promote longevity of trees. Many trees will fail because they have poor structure or they're pruned improperly, which can increase the chance of failure. What I'm pointing at there is called included bark, which we'll go over. And it's two stems that are the same size, and it makes a really weak union, and that's where we're seeing a lot of tree failures. And I'm borrowing some slides from Dr. Ed Gelman out of the University of Florida. You can tell his photos. We don't have palm trees in these tropical plants, but I'll talk about him more later. He's going to help me explain what good structure looks like. So we're aiming for a single trunk there on the left, essentially. When we get multiple trunks, then we can get what's referred to as codominant stems. So they're nearly the same in diameter. And then the bark is overlapping and pushing against each other. You know, as trees get older, their stems grow wider. And then you have this weak attachment point, and you can often see this bulge down here. And And that's when we're seeing failures in the landscape. And trees aren't living as long as they can, and they're not providing all of the benefits and being a part of our ecosystem as long as they could if we could help prevent that. So essentially what we're looking at here is we're shooting for more of a union that's U-shaped on the right rather than a tight V-shaped crotch on the left. And this is down on the Ozarks recently. This is the biggest set of what we call elephant ears that I've ever seen. It's the same tree, two pictures. On the right, you can see this shape that comes out, and you have this bulging from this tight union where the wood is growing against each other and bulging out. So you can assume that within this crotch, there's a lot of decay. And it's a really a weak point. And here is another one of Ed Gilman's slides. Thank you, Ed. Showing what the inside of that looks like. So that's why we're seeing failures with these types of structures. Here's a couple of trees that I consulted on and almost worked on the left. So what you'll see is you'll have a stem failure from this problem, and then you're left with half of the tree, but it has this massive decay column. It's making a really weak point in the tree, and then you have an increased load that this remaining half of the tree isn't used to. And so often you'll see the rest of the tree fail when that happens. So I did recommend that my friend's mom here removed their tree. This is a mulberry here on the right on the east side of town. And we originally went here with intent of cabling this tree potentially, but it was in an active state of failure is what we call that. So we could hear it creaking, and our recommendation was a full removal. And I won't get into cabling, but I could if this presentation was 2 hours long. Something to consult an arborist about. Okay. So here's just another great picture from Ed, a strong union. So really what we want is we want branches to be a half or less than the size of the parent stem. So the main trunk or the stem that it's attached to. And, you know, you'll get used to looking for this, but with the included bark, you're getting a sink and a divot where the bark is starting to invert. It's an inversion. And then you still have a branch bark ridge on a strong union, but it will keep its peak. Okay, so that's a large part of our pruning objectives. We kind of went over reducing risk. I'll talk a little more about it. Preventing interference with our built environment, missing a word, developing structure. I'm just gonna go through a few other reasons that we may or may not want to prune trees. So this is what we just talked about. These are all pictures of weak unions. Like I said, we want branches less than half of the parent stem, and we are looking to suppress stems with tight to V-shaped unions. And there is a really good example. You can see the bark inclusion is making a divot here, or the branch bark ridge might be. So what we're doing, and we'll go through this later, is encouraging one main leader so we don't have this issue. Another point on risk is deadwood. We talk a lot about removing deadwood as a pruning practice, but can we move the target? So if I have a dead branch and I think it might fall, is that okay if I can move this bench out of the way and just not hang out there instead? Sometimes you can't move the target. This is a home. You can't move a house. So there was this big stem here that we removed. Some misconceptions about deadwood. I really liked this article, Taking an Ecosystem Approach to Tree Management. So a lot of deadwood, it might, people remove it because they want to sanitize the tree. They think that it could be food for insects, pests, and disease, but it's a part of our ecosystem, and it is providing something for insects to feed on. But most insects are not tree pests, so there's not a lot of repercussion for them feeding on the tree. And I just have to make this point clear, like, why are we always sanitizing our landscape? So removing all the deadwood from our tree, taking all of the prune material off site. When we would prune other clients' trees, I would collect the deadwood, especially the stuff with cool cavities, and I would bring it home to my yard and put it there so like insects and animals could live in it. Don't get me started on that. I'll move on. Okay, so developing desired structure, there's maybe a lot of reasons that we want to manipulate a plant to grow a certain way. Here I'm just showing like a red bud can have a tree form, or it can be multi-stems. These might be more likely to fail, and there's certainly less likely that you're going to get the red bud to be the height so it's out of the way of the streets and the pedestrians. So here's some other species that come to mind. This is a tree that it was, the top died back, and so it had multiple stump sprouts. So I pruned it, this is probably 4 years ago now, to be just one single stem. And I checked on it on, these pictures are from Saturday, and it's still holding strong. We haven't completely healed down here, and maybe we won't. It's a small tree, but you can see that this has increased a lot in diameter over the years. And then for timber production, and coppicing is something that's been done for centuries to remove a tree, let the stump sprouts grow, and it increases fodder for livestock or firewood production or a myriad of other reasons. So it's another reason that makes sense why we prune. Um, Talking about improving or maintaining health. So Chuck Connor and I think hopefully all of you know him. He's a colleague of mine, and I learned so much from him. We've talked about this a bit over the past few weeks. A lot of times it's too late once you see a disease in a tree. A lot of cankers may be able to be pruned out. You have to prune significantly below where the infection is. And then Dutch elm's disease is what I'm showing here, because if you catch it early when it's flagging, which is what we call this, when you're just seeing a little bit of dieback, then you can sometimes prune it out and then begin to treat your elm tree with fungicide. So basically it's case by case, and sometimes. And then I just want to mention retrenchment pruning. When trees get old, they go into what's called retrenchment, and they are starting to make themselves smaller so that they're easier to sustain. And maybe we can extend the lifespan of trees and just make them safer to be around if we're just going and pulling back some of this wood if it's in a high traffic area, or maybe we're leaving it. Like I said, if this is in the middle of my field and no one ever goes around this tree, it's great wildlife habitat. Speaking of wildlife habitat, sometimes when Chuck and I walk around with forest landowners, we will recommend pruning just for the sake of creating more den trees. There at the bottom it says you're shooting for at least 3 den trees per acre. So because wounds cause decay, they make great houses, and sometimes we need more of those out there. I just want to mention these. This is kind of like a newer practice that's being more popularized in our arboriculture industry. Check out this article by Brian French. He goes over a lot of this stuff, but it's pruning intentionally to leave fractures and tears so we have more wildlife habitat when we can. Want to just make a note on pruning systems. We have national standards for how people should be treating trees. And they kind of revised these majorly in 2017. And the system that we adhere to mostly is natural pruning. What we're talking about falls underneath that. There are all these other specialized pruning systems that I'm not going to go over, but that's kind of how the standards are spoken about. In the past, they used the words thinning and cleaning, but they're no longer common. They actually removed thinning from the pruning section of the standards and kind of put it in the glossary in the back. We still use the terms crown raising, crown reduction, and then you're hearing a lot more just structural pruning and reduction cuts. And that's what we're going to hit on here now. So pruning approach. Now it's time. We're going to go try and prune our tree. What do we do? So if you like things like these that help you, if it helps you remember, we're remembering our ABCs. So A is assess. Is the tree healthy? Did it get hit by a weed whacker all summer last year and it has a huge wound at the bottom? Does it have a lot of deadwood in it? Does it have a lot of sucker sprouts? Is it stressed? If it is, then I probably am not going to, worsen it by making a bunch of wounds on the tree. We'll work on health and come back later. And then we're looking for the central leader. So we talked about that a bit earlier, and I'll get into it more, but which is going to be the main trunk? We're looking for those bark inclusions, reflecting, do I really need to prune this tree? Does the structure need it? And then an assessment, you might think about what height you want the canopy to start at. So, back to that tree in Olathe where we didn't prune, I think is amazing. But sometimes we need to when we're, in the city right of way. So we're choosing our scaffold branches or our first permanent branch because, as trees grow taller, the limbs aren't going to raise with it, right? Wherever they originate from the stem is where they're going to be. So all of the lower branches you can consider temporary. Bad branches. So we talked about deadwood, we talked about disease, we're removing damaged branches. How can you tell if wood is dead? This picture kind of shows how the tree will naturally start to have grow tissue around the tree branch that it's abscising and shedding. So also maybe discolored, and then you won't see the presence of live buds. And then if all else fails, you can scratch it with your nail gently, and then if it's alive, it'll be green underneath. Just crossing branches, and then again, we're looking at codominant stems and reducing those down. So you choose your main stem, and then it's time to cut. So a question is, do you have to take it all at one time? Do you have to remove a giant limb all the way back to the trunk, or can you reduce it back and come back later? Different cuts, reduction cuts we'll talk a lot about. Removal cuts is when you're removing it all the way back to the trunk. And we'll hit on heading cuts. Snap cuts, you have to come find me in the field, and I'll show you that. It's a fun trick. So just a note on how trees react to wounds. They don't heal like we do when we get a wound. They just try to compartmentalize and close over the wound. There is a reaction zone here, right where the branch is attached, and it has chemical and physical response to try to prevent the spread of decay. And the bigger the cut that we make and the closer the cut that we make, then it increases the amount of decay, and we get these decay columns all the way down the stem. And if we have more decay, then we lose strength and we have weaker attachments for remaining stems. So we want to make cuts as small as possible because 100% of large cuts will cause decay. Check out Chris Lowley's books and articles on decay too, if you want to know more on that. So making a proper cut. We want to be outside of the branch collar. You see the branch bark ridge we talked about earlier. When a stem is an appropriate size, less than half the size of the parent stem, a lot of times you'll see this swollen tissue here, which is what we're calling the branch collar. And that's where all of that chemical reaction happens. So we want to stay outside of it. Okay. Oh yeah, I love this slide that loads here. So this is a tree of mine in my friend's yard that I pruned in 2021. Just want to show you here that sometimes you can't see a branch collar. So where do you cut? And one general rule of thumb that is helpful is you're looking at the branch bark ridge. You're looking at the going perpendicular to the stem, and then about halfway between. So I could have made this a little bit more diagonal, I think, but we did close up 4 years later. So again, you have to take it all at one time. This is how I train people to prune in the field, thinking of a tree as a plumbing system. So if you close off the pipes or the branches with a reduction cut, then you have less water and resources flowing through these stems. So this growth is stunted on the remaining part, but the main trunk begins to grow, and trees grow wider as they get bigger, right? So then when you come back in a few years and you make the removal cuts down where the branches are attached, then those cuts and wounds will be relatively smaller than they would be if you would have taken it all at one time. And here's just an example of that. They've got several codominant stems in this tree. So rather than removing them all the way back to the trunk, they made reduction cuts, and maybe they'll leave it as that, or maybe they'll come back in a few years and remove the rest of those if they feel they need to. So the best practice is to prune back to a branch no smaller than a third of the diameter of the parent stem. And just as I'm showing here with this pruning cut that I made. And if you can't find that, then you can use what's called a heading cut. Use your head to delay decay is kind of something that Chris Lilly came up with. And here's a maple. A lot of times on these young maples, there's not a good branch to bring it back to, so you'll make a heading cut instead, which looks a little stubby, and it can result in more water sprouts too. And here's just what that might look like on a really small tree. Sometimes this is called tipping, but also heading. And when we're cutting on larger branches, anything like larger than your wrist or your thumb, I guess, it depends if you can hold it or not, you're using the 3-point cut. So we're making a relief cut first on the bottom, and then we're making our top cut. So that way, when the weight of this limb starts to fall, it will hit the relief cut, and then it will just pop off instead of tearing down the stem. And then we'll go back and make our final, our third cut. When to prune, not at time of planting. Generally, there are some exceptions. This is a really fast growing tree, but I usually advise people to wait so the tree can focus on root development. Just avoid basically when leaves are coming on trees and when they're falling off, because they're trying to put their energy towards leafing out and then energy reserves in their roots. And then we also want to avoid pruning oaks between November and February to prevent the spread of oak wilt, which is a deadly fungal disease that is spread by beetles. How much? General rules of thumb here, not raising the canopy more than a fourth, or more than a third, excuse me, or removing more than a fourth. So a good way to remember how much is make a pile by yourself so you can kind of keep track of how much you've removed. Okay, so when is it time to hire an arborist? When you think that you need to get to the top of the tree and do something like that. So that's going up and making a reduction cut. And also, if you want a risk assessment, they can help you talk through some of these things. You can find certified arborists with ISA or with Kansas Arborist Association. I always point people to that because we don't have something comparable in Missouri. You can go to their website to find folks. But just remember, like, a prune tree isn't necessarily a healthy tree. Just because we can doesn't mean that we should. So remembering what we've talked about today. If it's a public tree, if it's in the right of way, then you should contact the city and see how they want to handle it. Do you manage it? Does the city do that pruning for you? And this is just the KCMO example. You can find tree requests on 311. Okay, so this will be our pop quiz question, and this is stuff that I really want to see less of in the landscape. I won't harp on this. This is just a pruning cut that is too close, and you can tell you've made it too close when you can see this green tissue, and you can see it's not healing like the sides are where it was made in the correct spot. This is a really extreme version of that. It's a flush cut, so there's a chance that that never heals because you cut through all that chemical reaction. When you're getting started, and just generally, I advise that you keep a stub rather than cutting a flush cut. Okay, and here's just a really giant pruning to cut that will cause decay and never heal. This is a larger limb, so we should have done that 3-point cut and made our relief cut here. So when the stem fell, it popped off instead of tearing down the stem. Topping trees historically was a really common practice, but here's reasons not to. It really puts the tree in shock, and those rapid sprouts never make strong connections, and you'll often see them fall later anyhow. Seems to be a pretty general consensus in the arboriculture community that we were making exceptions for calorie pear trees because they're so fast growing. They have so many stems to manage. But what's the best cut for a calorie pear tree is a base cut, just a 1-cut method, and then you can get a new free native tree from Deep Roots on their buyback. This is lion's tailing here on the left. So this is one of the most common problems and improper practices that I'm seeing. Companies are removing every single branch on the interior that they can reach. So you're leaving all of the load out there at the end of the tree. And then if the tree does have top dieback and it needs pruned, there's nothing to prune it back to. It makes a really weak tree. So we need to be going way out here in the canopy and pruning from the stems in. Here's just kind of another example of that. On the left is improper, on the right is more ideal. Unfortunately, if someone prunes your tree properly, often you can't even tell that it's been touched, which I know is really unsatisfying for paying customers, but that's the truth of the matter. Okay, so here's another example of an improper practice. Sydney, I put wildflowers in this landscape for you because I couldn't do a Deep Roots presentation and leaving it so sterile. but okay, you have this tree here on the right and your neighbor's tree is here on the left, and you want it to get it off your house, which I totally understand. But this is what I'm seeing a lot lately. You're calling it like the 40-foot special, where we're just removing every single limb and then making this gap. But so what happens with the remaining branches up here fail? It's increasing the velocity of the fall. There's no branches below it to break its fall, so you're getting a higher impact to your roof. And you're also making massive wounds that might not ever close on the stem, making a weaker tree. So what I want to see more of is reduction pruning. If people know what they're doing, they should be going out with the tips of the canopy and bringing it the limbs in. And like I said, you can always go remove the limbs fully later if you need to. Gaffing or using climbing spurs up trees, we're not supposed to be doing that. So people should only be using those if they're going to remove the tree. And then here's just another over raising on the left. I call that a lollipop. I don't know if that's the technical term. So we're looking out for our trees, but I don't want the arborist community or tree care community to come after me. Like, I've been in their shoes, and it's really frustrating to have people like hovering and not trusting you to do your job as well. So yeah, just like take it easy and have conversations. But I love this little gif here. People get really upset if we like are removing a whole tree and then there's like a little bit of lawn damage. It's like, oh my gosh, it's so much woody material. So take it easy. Pruning tools, don't forget your personal protective equipment, please. Sanitization, mostly only doing that if we do have an infected tree. So if you're pruning out that flagging from an elm tree, we're sanitizing between cuts. In orchards, also between trees. And then just often, generally, regardless, we never really know what could be on our tools. Okay, so we have our hand pruners, which we want to prefer bypass pruners, which I'll show you in a second. Loppers aren't my favorite. They always seem to make this little tear that you see on the right. We have folding hand saws. That's the handsaw I use in the center, and I love my little saw pod holder so I can keep hands free and keep it on my leg. That's a silky handsaw. I can give Sydney the name if anyone's interested. So we want blades that bypass each other rather than anvil blades that can actually crush tissue. And then for overhead cuts, we've got pole saws, pole pruner. Please play like we have our hard hats on because we probably should, but you can get these at Home Depot. Okay, well, like I said, practice makes perfect. So get out there and learn with Heartland Tree Alliance. They do pruning for beginners. We should have one coming up, but I put that code here. If you scan that, it'll take you to their page for all of their classes. Also, just if you have the space and you have volunteer trees growing around you, then they're free trees to practice on. So, okay, yeah, just another nod to Ed Gilman. So he helped me with some of these slides here. He wrote a great book on pruning, and then he has just so much free information and interesting videos on his website. So check that out. And oh my gosh, I made it on time with 2 minutes to spare. So yeah, just summary, pruning wounds can cause decay. So we're being thoughtful, making small cuts and removing trees when they are young, and focusing on that strong structure so trees will live as long as they can. Remember the ABCs if it's helpful, assess bad branches and then cut, and then contact a professional if you need help, and make sure you're really specific with what you're asking them to do. So that's all I got, Sid.
Taylor, that was amazing.
Okay, yay.
Dude, seriously, everything about this was absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much for sharing that. And we actually have quite a few questions in our Q&A. So since we've got time, let's dive in. And also for folks, this was such an amazing presentation with so much great information. So don't forget, it is recorded and I will be uploading it to both our website and YouTube channel following today's show, probably by the end of today. But keep an eye out because I will be emailing you information, including all these great resources Taylor mentioned. I was taking notes, writing down different articles and books, and we'll be sure to share that all with you all in the next day or so. Okay, so let's dive in. Taylor, our first question from Sarah is about maple trees. Should maple trees be pruned later in spring or early summer due to their sap raising soon?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the sap, it might be unsightly, but it's really not a concern as far as tree health goes. Yeah, and bringing up a specific species, different species do have better and worse responses to decay. And actually, Ed Gilman has a list from just what he's heard in the industry too. Around here, maples do seem to, they're one of the, oh, excuse me, there's my timer. They compartmentalize not as well as some other species when we're making large cuts on maples, but they do really good pruning them when they're young. But yeah, the sap really isn't a concern, but it's a good question. I get that a
Okay.
lot.
Yeah. That's good. I know not like hardly anything about trees, so this whole time I've just been like taking it all in. Okay, so we're gonna jump into our next question from Barbara. Barbara bought two crabapple trees. This sounds like the start of a mathematics problem, but I promise it's not. Um, they are lollipop shaped with no leader stem. The limbs brush out about 4 feet off the ground. How should they prune them to grow and be able to walk or mow beneath them?
Yeah. Okay. So I didn't get too much into different forms of trees. So when you have something like a crabapple or even a red bud, you're often not going to get just like a single stem leader ever, but you still want to be reducing those V-shaped unions throughout the tree as much as you can. And then, like I said, I mentioned in a slide, if you want to raise a tree, right, um, don't do it all at one time. So we're not raising it more than a fourth or a third at the most of the height. And you can kind of have an idea in your head of like, okay, this will be my first permanent branch. Someday I'll remove all of these lower branches. And for now, maybe I can just reduce them slowly. So then as the tree continues to get taller, then I'll slowly remove those over time because they do help grow a stronger trunk taper and make a trunk that's less likely to fail. So yeah, I would just be looking for the tight crotches and then reducing the lower limbs that you want to remove eventually and do it over time if you can.
Okay. So, kind of related to this conversation, Val mentions that they've observed some trees seem to naturally develop narrow crotches. Should you just avoid planting them?
I do. Except the hybrid elms. They've come out with elms that are resistant to the Dutch elms disease, and they grow really tight crotches too. But I think it's worth it time and investment because they also heal really well. But yeah, like Japanese zelkovas, I see a lot in the landscape. There's a line like right just south of the Discovery Center parking lot, and they are so hard to prune and get into those tight crotches and manage that. So sometimes it's like I can't even. And then a pear trees, they're notorious, for all of their invasive qualities, but they're very notorious in the landscape trade for falling apart because they have so many multiple stems. So play around with it. A lot of the species that do grow multiple stems can withstand a lot of pruning. So, but yeah, it's good point and good question. I'm glad that you said that so I could bring up those species specifically.
Good deal. Okay. Um, Anonymous would like for you to touch more on the poor qualities or practices that do encourage pest or disease introduction, as dead wood is commonly misunderstood as a vector for problems.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So practices that do promote disease. So definitely pruning oaks outside of November to February. I see a lot. And the vector that transmits oak wilt can they can like sense and smell the pheromones that are released from the pruning cut and they can be to the tree like within 20 minutes.
Whoa.
So pruning oaks outside of season and then doing the flush cuts and pruning way too close to the stem. So you're making like Chris Lilly's words are 100% of large cuts will cause decay. So that, and then also just like generally bad cultural practices. So, it's, I don't want to, it's getting hotter and we have wetter wet seasons and we still have droughts. So like all of these things are great conditions for fungi to thrive. So if we can water when drought, so our trees are less stressed, if we can apply mulch properly to the base of our trees to retain moisture, then we will be less likely to see these decay fungi. When you see a disease or a fungi, often it's not the causal agent. It's a response, and they're attacking a tree that's already really stressed by something else. So protecting our trees and really watering will prevent a lot of that.
That makes total sense. And in fact, you mentioned Chuck Connor earlier, and he kind of brought that to light for me and many of our viewers is make sure you're watering your trees, especially during winter droughts, which is something I never really thought about prior to that conversation of forest ecology.
Yeah, I will say the 2024 Forest Health highlights should be becoming available soon. So I'll make sure that you get that resource, Sydney. But our forest entomologist kind of goes over what's going on with the health of Missouri trees right now. And it's not a lot of great news. So yeah, if we can water, that would be amazingly helpful.
Yes. Gosh. Yeah, it's not always the happiest news, but it's really important information to have. Okay. So we've got several more questions. Let me jump into one about deer damaging trees. Anonymous says they have several four-year-old oaks that were damaged by deer rubs. How do they determine when to cull and replace the trees depending on the depth and extent of the damage?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't found the answer to really myself. I was talking about planting trees at the cemetery in March, and we planted trees last year and we didn't protect them fast enough. So many of them have deer rub on them. So it just depends. If you have limited space, sometimes it's not okay to just say the wait and see thing isn't really helpful. Um, and I don't know. I'd have to do some more research on what other people are seeing. A lot of the times, you'll get deer rub all the way up the stem, and so potentially that's going to be a wound that the tree is going to try to heal over. But is the tree mulched? Is the tree receiving water so it can actually grow that wound wood and close that over? You're Feel free to send me pictures. Yes, that goes
Good
for
idea.
everybody.
That's perfect. Yeah, and folks, Taylor's contact information will be provided in the resources following today's show, so you can ask her your questions if we don't get to them, or if you have follow-up questions. And another question actually related to water. Laura asks, can you overwater a tree? Is that possible?
Yeah, you can overwater a tree, especially since we have such high clay content in our soils. So we get those saturated clay soils. And especially if people have irrigation systems and they're running irrigation like on their lawns. So deep, infrequent watering, like less frequent watering, is better than like a sprinkler system that's watering your lawn every single day. A lot of that water is not getting below the root mat of the turf to the roots, anyways. But yeah, you can certainly overwater your trees, and then you're increasing and making an environment where fungus and disease will really like that. So um, I always encourage people, like, how much do I water? Like, go outside and stick your finger in the soil. Like, that's the best answer. But you can get moisture probes too. But yes, long answer, long.
Well, okay, so you mentioned like spreading of diseases. So to segue into our next question, someone asked, let me see here. Question about, oh, here we go. Jules is asking, what are your practices in the field for keeping tools sanitized while moving from tree to tree? How do you handle that?
Yeah, so a spray bottle with like 100% denatured alcohol on it. When I was putting this together, I was like, man, I kind of want to research like if there's any, like, I use like vinegar to like clean my counters, but no, use like 100% alcohol and spray it on there, and then just make sure that when you're done, you like oil your tools, or
Mhm.
and make sure that they're not wet so that way your tools aren't rusting. But yeah, when I'm in an orchard and I go help my friends prune their orchard trees, it's between trees for sure. And then, yeah, if we're on something like an elm or an oak tree, it's often like even between cuts.
Okay, well, perfect segue into this next question about fruit trees. Would you do anything different for pruning fruit trees? River asks. The home we bought has 5 types of young fruit trees. Some have fruited for 2 years, some only one. There may be some that haven't even fruited yet. They've lived there 3 years and have never pruned them. They now know they should. They just didn't know what to do. So, what are the kind of key differences, if there are any?
That's amazing. And I figured I would get a question about fruit trees, which, yes, is completely different than most of what I talked about, but you still want to do reduce the bark inclusions and the V-shaped unions. That stays the same. And there are lots of different schools of thoughts on pruning trees. I think I saw that Kansas City Community Gardens put out a dormant tree pruning video last week, so I would point you to them. And the Giving Grove has a guide on pruning fruit trees. When we talk about thinning trees, which we're not really doing with ornamental and shade trees anymore, we're using reduction cuts. But we do use thinning in orchard settings because we want to increase airflow and sunlight to the fruit, reduce chance of disease. There are a lot more orchard diseases that are more concerning. But like I said, there are multiple schools of thought. So I've lived at a couple of farms in our region that both grow fruit trees. One, we prune the trees so much every dormant season, every spring, and it's a lot. It's a lot of upkeep. And then on the other hand, I lived at a different farm, and she doesn't prune her fruit trees at all. So she still has a bunch of fruit drop, but she is seeing like some failures of branches with just like the increased load of the fruit. But it's much less manipulative of the system as a natural system, and she still gets hundreds of pounds of apples and fruit from her trees. So yeah, I would tell you to reach out to Giving Grove and Kansas City Community Gardens as a starting point for more information.
That's a really good suggestion. And I actually got to work with Kay of Casey Community Gardens on Tuesday during our greenhouse session. And Kay mentioned that every Friday from 9 to noon, they'll be hosting a tree pruning at the community garden right by the Discovery Center. So, folks, if you want to learn more about that, I'll be sure to include that in our resource notes. I will probably attend at least one of those sessions because I really think learning by doing it hands-on, as you mentioned, Taylor, is one of the best ways to learn how to do it properly. So, and working with the experts who know how to do it. So. Okay, so we have a pop quiz question for you all, and then we're going to answer a few more questions. But Taylor, if you want to go ahead and ask today's question, and whoever answers, the first person to answer it correctly in the chat. Now, make sure you have your chat set to send to everyone so that we can see it. Go ahead and ask your question, Taylor, and then let us know what the folks in the audience could win.
Okay, so name one improper pruning practice that we want to avoid. That was fast. I think someone said topping. Yep.
All right. Looks like who was that first?
Kathy Hoyer.
Kathy Boyer. So Kathy, I will be sure to reach out to you for your address. And Taylor, let Kathy know what they've won today.
Oh yeah, I picked up a Felco folding handsaw from Soil Service.
Ooh, very nice. That's an awesome tool. Okay, Kathy Hoyer. Congratulations, Kathy. I'll be in touch following today's program. And looking at the webinar chat, so many amazing answers here. So you all have been paying attention and you all get an A+ for today's pop quiz.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to answer just a few more questions. And then, folks, if we don't get your question answered, be sure to follow up with Taylor. Like I said, I will be including her email and the resources following today's show. And before we actually jump into a couple more questions, I do want to let you all know that if you want to come to the Discovery Center tomorrow, I'm hosting our Native Landscape Chat, which is free. You just show up at 1 o'clock in the lobby, and we're going to take a walk and we can look at trees. We're going to look at some cool dormant species in the landscape. There's tons of birds right now, too. This is also a really good opportunity to bring your gardening questions. So if you're in the Kansas City area, consider joining me tomorrow in person at 1 o'clock at the Anita B. Gorman Conservation Discovery Center. Okay, let's jump into a couple more questions before we end today's program. Let's see here. Okay. Um, okay, I kind of need to know about this too. What's up with your tree climbing championship, Taylor?
Ah, um, yeah, it's a thing. It's a whole thing. So yeah, I learned how to climb a little bit when I was working for a tree care company, and they have regional climbing competitions. They have climbing competitions throughout the world. So yeah, Midwest Regional we had in Parkville, um, not last this past year, but the 2 years prior. So I just went up there to the park to volunteer for the event, and they're like, "Hey, don't you climb? Like, what don't you just want to? Don't you want to compete instead?" And I was like, "Yeah, I guess. Let me try it." And yes, I know. I just saw someone say Meredith Ann Koenig is a colleague of mine, has the same position in Columbia, and she also tree climbed. So yeah, I hopped in and competed. It's an absolute blast. And then I did it again. And I think I'll do it one more time this June. We'll go back to Tulsa and compete, see how I do. And then after that, I'll probably just retire. I like to climb for fun more, and it can be a little, it's pretty challenging. And there's amazing climbers. Yeah, YouTube it. It's cool.
Amazing. That's so cool. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, and for our final question today, Jean Harris says that they have a service berry in a pot that has multiple branches. I was hoping to have a tree shape instead of a bush. Should I prune before or after planting, or should I just go with that bush shape?
I would definitely plant it and then wait a couple of years. If it were me, I would plant it, wait a couple of years, and then start to work on that structure. And you can try to make it into a tree form. Yeah. And then it might, try to send out different stems, but it's certainly possible.
And what do you do when trees send out little suckers? Like I know serviceberry, lots of multi-stem trees do that, including dogwoods. Do you have any best practices for removing suckers?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. It's something I cut from my presentation. So the sucker sprouts at the base of the tree, always remove those. So that's taking away energy from the rest of the tree growth, which is what you want to promote. And a lot of times you'll see water sprouts, which are different from suckers and growing on the actual tree. And sometimes you want to remove those, especially like in an orchard setting where they're shooting up a lot of sprouts and making stems that might not ever produce any fruit and are taking resources away from fruit producing spurs. So you can remove them then. If you make a pruning cuts and you prune too much, then you will see a lot of these sprouts around your pruning cut. And I like to leave most of those until at least the wound has healed, because the tree it's a stress response. It's saying, oh my God, you just removed all of my sugar manufacturing and all of this foliage. So quick, I'm going to try to put out more so I can collect more sugars. And if they're doing that right at the point where you have a wound and a pruning cut, then they are supporting the reaction wound, and the wound would to grow. So I like to leave those. I generally don't worry about them. It's another like aesthetic value thing that people have you remove, but they are a sign of stress. So maybe you should inspect the root collar at the base, inspect the root zone, see if there's a girdling root, and another reason why the tree is stressed, because it is a sign of stress. I don't mean to ramble, but I do think that sprouting is very cool. When I first started climbing trees and getting into arboriculture, my friend Jesse, who used to be the Mission Hills city arborist, he explained like just that stress response and what sprouts are telling you, what the tree is telling you. And that was like one of the first things that really clicked with me and kind of like personified the tree, and it made me like relate to that, and it was like a really special moment. So
No, I love that. And have you met me, like rambling queen over here? So this is, I mean, this is exactly what these programs are for, to talk with experts like you, to learn the ins and outs of what you love and care about. So no, that's great. And then I know I had said last question, but then I asked you two more questions. I do have one final question, then I will let you go. But Mike is asking when the best time would be to prune serviceberry and buttonbush. And can you just give us like a general reminder of, generally speaking, best time for pruning trees and shrubs?
yeah, some people say the best time to prune is whenever you have time. So that's like if you're working like a tree care company or pruning city trees and you have a lot to do. But if you can choose, avoiding when leaves are coming on, leaf on, and when leaves are coming off. So in the spring, they're using their reserves to put on new, it's a large, expensive energy to put on new foliage. So we don't want to make wounds at that time. And then the same when we're about to go into dormant season, they're trying to soak up as much sugar they can from their foliage to store down in their roots for the dormant season. So we want to avoid that too. Remembering about oak wilt. And then another consideration for timing is fruiting. Some plants fruit on new growth, and some plants they fruit and flower on old growth. So just Google like the species and which it is, and that will tell you if you want to prune in the late fall, or if you want to, if you can prune any time and it's going to still flower on new growth. So there's
Okay.
nuance to these things, but good question.
Definitely. I know there's never a one answer fits all kind of deal, but I appreciate you so much, and as does our audience. This has been a very popular program today. So Taylor, thank you from Deep Roots and from our community for sharing your expertise with pruning trees. And folks, we hope you'll join us for our next program on February 20th, where we will be going over 10 years of habitat restoration at Dillon Farms with habitat architecture, with guest experts Shannon Tyree and Larry Rizzo. So stay tuned for our next program and have a great rest of your week. Thank you so much.